As we advanced, every step felt laden with tension and purpose. Minor setbacks, like the loosening of our packs, were quickly brushed aside as we pressed forward, acutely aware of the dangers that lay ahead. Under General Custer's guidance, we moved with purpose and resolve, each maneuver bringing us closer to the momentous clash that would etch itself into our memories and mark the Battle of the Little Bighorn. At one point, several of our packs loosened, prompting us to cut the ropes and abandon them. One of these belonged to my unit, likely retrieved later by the natives. We descended into a ravine and established a temporary camp without removing the saddles from our horses. Simply draping the reins over our arms, we drifted off to sleep, a familiar practice for cavalrymen constantly on the move. It seems that General Custer, along with a few scouts, had ventured ahead to gather intelligence on the nearby native encampment. Upon his return, he convened the officers and provided directives for the battalion formations. Before moving out, we enjoyed a hearty breakfast consisting of raw bacon, hardtack, and cold water, which we found quite satisfying. At this point, General Custer divided the regiment into 3 distinct battalions. He led one himself, which included Troop C under Captains Thomas W. Custer, his brother, Troop Y led by Capt. Miles W. Keogh, Troop F commanded by Capt. George W. Yates, Troop L under 1st Lieutenant James Calhoun, his brother-in-law, and Troop E commanded by 1st Lieutenant Algernon E. Smith. Another battalion comprising 3 troops was placed under Madge. Marcus A. Reno's command, consisting of Troop M led by Capt. Thomas H. French, Troop G under 1st Lieutenant Donald McIntosh, and Troop A commanded by Capt. Miles Moylan. The 3rd Battalion was led by Capt. Frederick W. Benteen, which included his own Troop H, Troop K under 1st Lieutenant Edward S. Godfrey, and Troop D led by Capt. Thomas B. Weir. The supply train comprised approximately 150 pack mules, accompanied by Capt. Thomas M. McDougall and his Troop B, along with detachments from the other 11 companies, overseen by 1st Lieutenant Edward G. Matthey of Troop M. This train followed Custer's path and later joined Reno's battalion on the Bluffs, which proved fortunate as we were on the brink of running out of ammunition. We then crossed the divide with Lieutenant Hodgson, assigned as adjutant to Reno's battalion, riding along the line, instructing us to maintain some distance from the preceding company to minimize dust that might alert the natives. After crossing the divide, we proceeded down a small valley and around the base of a bluff. There, we encountered a few abandoned lodges with their fronts tied shut. It appeared that General Crook's command had engaged with some of the natives on the 17th, resulting in the deaths of several chiefs whose bodies were placed inside these lodges. We were unaware of this at the time, and it seemed Custer was preparing to charge, assuming it was a native camp. As we advanced, we could see shapes in the distance, unsure if they were natives or buffalo. At this moment, I understood that Custer ordered Reno to pursue the natives, stating he would support him, although I did not hear the command myself. This marked our last sighting of Custer's battalion until we discovered their bodies on the morning of the 27th. Custer and his troops veered to the right, while Reno's battalion continued down the valley towards the Little Bighorn River, with Benteen branching off to the left. Reno's battalion began its descent down the valley, first at a trot and then transitioning into a gallop, marching in pairs. Ahead of us rode Lieutenant Varnum, a courageous young officer leading the scouts. He waved his hat triumphantly in the air and called out to the men, 30 days furlough to the man who gets the first scalp. While we were all eager for that furlough, the scalp wasn't our primary concern. Upon reaching the banks of the Little Bighorn River, we forded to the other side, facing a strong current and treacherous quicksand about 3 feet deep. After a brief pause on the opposite bank, we dismounted to tighten our saddle girths before swinging back into our saddles. Once mounted, we formed up, executing a left front into line, with Captain French's Company M on the right, Lieutenant McIntosh's company on the left, and Captain Moylan's troops in the rear. We found ourselves in the Little Bighorn Valley, facing downstream. Starting with a trot, we soon broke into a slow gallop. Between the right flank of my company and the riverbank lay thick underbrush and bulberry bushes. Captain French instructed me to take 10 men to the right and form a skirmish line to cover the brush, suspecting that Indians might be hiding there. We advanced in this formation for about 1.5 miles to 2 miles until we reached a dense area of timber. As we neared the timber, a single shot rang out in the distance. I couldn't tell if it was fired by Lieutenant Varnum's scouts or by hostile Indians. That shot marked the beginning of the battle at Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876, and I was keenly aware of it at the time. When we reached the timber and were ordered to halt, Private James Turley from my troop lost control of his horse, which carried him toward the Indian camp. That was the last I ever saw of him. Turley was a good young man, and I remembered a small incident from a day or two before we left Fort Rice for the expedition. He had asked if he could store some of his belongings in my clothes chest, to which I agreed, but only on the condition that if he was killed, the contents would belong to me, and vice versa. After our return from the expedition, the possessions of those who fell were auctioned off, with the proceeds given to the paymaster. Upon reaching the timber, we rode down an embankment and quickly dismounted. This area marked a change in the river's channel, which was several feet lower than the prairie. We dismounted in haste, with every fourth man holding the horses. We then climbed onto higher ground, forming a skirmish line from the timber toward the bluffs across the valley, facing downstream toward the Indian camp. This was our first glimpse of the camp from the skirmish line, with some men lying down while others took a knee. Nearby, a prairie dog town provided us with mounds to use as temporary breastworks. Once our skirmish line was established, the Indians launched their first charge. Approximately 500 of them surged from the direction of their village, well mounted and armed. They attempted to breach our line, but we fired volleys that repelled their charge, sending several of them tumbling from their saddles. Lieutenant Hodgson moved along the line, urging the men to stay calm and aim low. When the enemy couldn't break through our lines, they arranged themselves in a single file, crouched low against their ponies, and began to circle us. They started to overlap our skirmish line on the left, moving in to complete the encirclement from behind. We received orders to retreat to our horses. It was during this chaotic moment that the first casualty occurred. Surged, Miles F. O'Hara from my Troop M. He had started as a corporal on this expedition, but had been promoted to sergeant just days before his death, taking the place of Surged, John Dolan, who had been discharged and was back with the wagon trains at Powder River. O'Hara was well regarded as an exceptional soldier in our troop, and his loss was deeply felt. In the aftermath, while we were destroying the Indian camp, we stumbled upon a chilling sight. The heads of 3 of our fallen comrades, gruesomely tied together with wires and hung from a lodgepole, their hair singed away. Their bodies were missing, likely discarded in the river by the natives. After regrouping at our horses, we were ordered to mount up, but confusion ensued. Some men couldn't locate their mounts. Major Reno had lost his hat, a red handkerchief now tied around his head. As we prepared to ride, I glanced back toward the river and spotted the Indians completing their circle, weaving through the brush while lying flat on their ponies. I pointed this out to Captain French, saying, "Captain, the Indians are in our rear." He replied dismissively, "Oh no, those are General Custer's men." Just then, an Indian fired, hitting Private George Lawrence from my company, who was positioned as the lead man in our first set of 4s. The bullet struck him in the back of the neck and exited through his mouth, causing him to pitch forward and collapse from his saddle. In that instant, the Indians opened fire from all sides, and I turned to Captain French and said, "The best thing that we can do is to cut right through them." By then, they had fully surrounded us, holding the higher ground. Major Reno then rode up, urging, "Any of you men who wish to make your escape, follow me." The command to charge rang out, and we surged up the steep embankment, pushing through the mass of Indians with Major Reno leading the way. As we fought our way through, it became a brutal hand-to-hand combat, and falling from a horse or sustaining a wound meant certain death if one couldn't keep pace with the unit. After making our way through, we retraced our steps over the same ground before veering left to reach the bluffs at the nearest point. The fighting here was intense, with a multitude of Indians surrounding us on all sides. In this fierce charge, we lost 30 men, with my company suffering 10 casualties, but we ultimately reached the river. Among those lost were Bloody Knife, the chief of Indian Scouts, Charlie Reynolds, a white scout, and Izar Dorman, the black interpreter. Lieutenant Hodgson was wounded and had his horse shot out from under him, while Lieutenant Donald McIntosh, a courageous and loyal officer in charge of Company G, was killed. In the chaos, Lieutenant DeRudio and Fred Gerard, another white scout, along with about 10 or 12 men, became separated from the main force. They took refuge in the brush, the woods, or crouched beneath the riverbank. Some of these men later shared with me that they stood in water up to their necks under the embankment, trying to stay hidden from the Indians. Two of them, Sergeants Charles White and Patrick Carney from my company, managed to reunite with us in the fortifications on the bluff after dark. At this juncture, the river spanned about 50 yards wide, with the water roughly 2.5 feet deep and a swift current. Lieutenant Hodgson, wounded and without a horse, asked one of the men to help carry him across. It was said that a trumpeter from my company named Fisher, better known as Bounce, instructed him to hold on to his stirrup. In a remarkable feat, the horse carried both the lieutenant and its rider across the river, but tragically, Hodgson was shot again and killed. I know of 3 men who have claimed to assist Hodgson during this harrowing moment. The opposite bank of the river loomed steeply, with the only route up to the bluffs being a narrow buffalo trail worn into the bank, just wide enough for a single person to pass at a time. Before we managed to cross the river, the fighting became frantic and intense, taking place at such close quarters that it felt almost desperate. In many instances, soldiers fired their revolvers point blank into the chests of the Indians. Once their weapons were empty, some discarded their revolvers entirely, hastily reaching for their carbines instead, unable to return their revolvers to their holsters. I believe that if Reno had stayed in the timber for just a bit longer, none of us would have escaped, as the Indians outnumbered us 10-1. As we scaled the bluff, tragedy struck. Dr. DeWolf, the contract surgeon for our expedition, was killed, along with Sergeant Clare from Company K, William D. Meyer, a farrier from Company M, and Henry Gordon from the same company. Their bodies, alongside others, lay hidden under the cover of our fire, preventing the Indians from having the chance to scalp them. Once we reached the bluffs, we could look back at the plains below, witnessing the horrific scene of the Indians stripping and scalping our fallen comrades, mutilating their bodies in a grotesque display. The prairie was engulfed in flames. The officers did everything in their power to rally us, but during this chaotic time, many of our men were cut down. After regrouping the companies, the firing eventually subsided, and we were joined by Benteen's battalion, the first sight of him since the regiment was divided. Shortly after, the pack train arrived, led by Company B under Captain McDougall. This was a stroke of luck, as our ammunition was nearly depleted, and we had no other source for supplies. We had several wounded men, and we did our best to care for them under the circumstances. At that time, I learned that Captain Weir with Company D had briefly left our command, following the direction of General Custer before returning, although I did not witness it. Leaving 2 companies behind to guard the packs and the wounded, Major Reno, with the remnants of 5 companies, proceeded in the direction we believed General Custer had taken, moving toward the Indian camp. We traveled about half a mile until we reached a high point that overlooked the Indian camp and the battlefield. In the distance, 1.5 to 2 miles away, we saw what appeared to be parties of Indians riding back and forth, firing sporadic shots. We suspected they were disposing of Custer's wounded men, which was later confirmed. As we paused for a moment, we spotted a large herd of ponies at the far end of the village, and we could distinguish a significant group of Indians approaching the camp. The prairie surrounding the village and the initial battlefield blazed with fire, set by the Indians to conceal their movements. Atop the bluff, we halted, noting a ford at its base. This was where Custer had first encountered the Indians, as we discovered some of the dead bodies there 2 days later. While we were on the bluffs, the Indians reappeared in large numbers from the direction of the gunfire. We exchanged shots with them, suffering a few casualties, before receiving orders to retreat to our packs and the wounded. Upon our return, we dismounted in a hurry, placing the wounded in a low depression on the bluffs and surrounding them with packs from the mules for shelter against the Indian fire. We then formed a protective circle with our pack mules and horses, establishing a skirmish line around the hollow, and lay down to wait for the Indians. We had only been in this position for a short time when the Indians advanced in overwhelming numbers from the direction we had just come. They launched several charges against us, and we repelled them each time. However, they soon surrounded us. The firing quickly escalated all along our line, becoming rapid and intense at close range. The company to the right of mine suffered numerous casualties within just minutes. A high ridge stood to our right, creating an opening in our lines, and I must commend one Indian in particular for his marksmanship. While we were lying in our line, he fired and struck the fourth man to my right. Not long after, he fired again, hitting the third man. His third shot wounded the man beside me, who stumbled back among the other wounded. At that moment, I felt certain my turn was next. I jumped up alongside Captain French and a handful of my fellow soldiers. Instead of firing straight ahead as we had been, we pivoted to our right and unleashed a fierce volley, which I believe silenced that Indian, as no more men fell at that spot thereafter. Captain French was one of the bravest officers in the 7th Cavalry, known for having killed several Indians on various occasions. He carried a Springfield rifle, caliber .50, a breechloader, and had a habit of cutting notches into the stock each time he shot an Indian. I recall one instance where he took aim at a curlew, firing 2 or 3 shots, but missing. Feeling discouraged, he threw the rifle away. Later, I found it, rolled it in a blanket, and placed it in one of the government wagons, bringing it back to Fort Rice, Dakota, after the expedition ended without his knowledge. When he learned I had it, he reclaimed it. Unfortunately, I learned later that he had retired from the service years afterward and met with a tragic accident. As darkness fell, the engagement on the 25th came to a close. We set to work with the limited tools at our disposal, using 2 spades, our knives, and tin cups. We even utilized pieces of hardtack boxes as makeshift spades, starting to construct temporary fortifications. We built breastworks from boxes of hardtack, sacks of bacon, sacks of corn and oats, blankets, anything we could gather. During the night, ammunition and rations reached us while we were entrenched in our positions, but we suffered severely from a lack of water. Although the river lay only 300 or 400 yards away, we couldn't reach it, as the Indians controlled access to it. Throughout the night, several men attempted to fetch water, but were either killed or forced to retreat. In the middle of the night, we heard a trumpet call, and the men began to cheer, thinking it was Custer's troops coming to our rescue. Major Reno ordered one of our trumpeters to sound a call in response, but when it wasn't echoed, we realized it might be a trap set by the Indians to lure us out of our defenses. The trumpet they used was probably one that once belonged to one of Custer's men, though we didn't realize it at the time. Leaving our position wasn't even an option. We had too many wounded comrades with us, some in serious condition. Throughout the night, we could hear the faint sounds of the Indians riding back and forth across the river. I think they suspected we might attempt a sudden escape. As dawn approached on the 26th, 2 shots rang out from the Indian side in quick succession. We couldn't stop wondering what had happened to Custer and his troops. That morning, fighting flared up once again. In no time, the Indians charged in force, trying relentlessly to break through. Captain Benteen's company was particularly under pressure. The men gave everything they had to push back the Indians who were gaining ground. Captain Benteen urgently called to Major Reno for reinforcements, shouting, "The Indians are doing their best to cut through my lines, and it will be impossible for me to hold my position much longer." Captain French's Company M immediately left its post and rushed to aid Captain Benteen's unit. Together, both companies launched a counterattack, pushing the Indians back down the hill. However, this charge came at a heavy cost. We lost several men in the process. This area of the battlefield was slightly elevated, making it a vital yet hard-fought position. The battle could have been a devastating loss if the Indians had succeeded, as Captain Benteen later reflected. Reno's command would have suffered the same tragic fate as Custer's courageous men. Private James Tanner from Company M was seriously injured during a charge, his body lying exposed on the side of the bluffs. Volunteers were called to retrieve him, and without hesitation, I grabbed a blanket alongside 3 others. Together, we hurried to his side, rolled him into the blanket, and swiftly carried him down to join the other wounded. Miraculously, despite the peril, none of us sustained injuries beyond a few bullets grazing our clothes. Sadly, after we laid Tanner among the wounded, he passed away within minutes. In our company was a remarkable gray horse, ridden by Captain French and known as the finest buffalo horse in the command. Unfortunately, the horse was near the wounded when an Indian shot him in the head. As he stumbled among the other horses, Private Henry C. Voigt reached to guide him out of harm's way, only to be struck fatally himself. The following morning, we buried Tanner and Voigt side by side, marking their grave with a makeshift headboard from a piece of hardtack box inscribed with their names in pencil. As the day wore on, the Indians' gunfire lessened, except for a few precise shots from a high bluff, likely in Custer's direction. Their firearms echoed with a deep, resounding noise, unlike anything our Springfield carbines could manage, as they were well beyond our range. Captain French approached me, wondering if anything could be done about those distant shots. I had a 15-pound Sharps telescope rifle, caliber .45, custom-made in Bismarck for $100 before the expedition, and I was willing to try. After a couple of test shots to gauge the distance, I found my mark and fired 6 quick rounds. That group of Indians scattered from their position, and soon our men erupted in cheers. It was the last fire from the Indians in that fateful battle. Shortly afterward, we watched as they retreated across the river, hurriedly packing up their lodges and preparing to leave. They stripped the hides off their tents, leaving only the poles, and moved up the valley of the Little Bighorn, crossing the field where Reno's battalion had fought and where so many had fallen. This was the largest assembly of Indians I had ever witnessed moving together, larger even than the combined Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, Apache, and Comanche camps I'd seen while serving with General Custer years prior. As they moved out of range, Captain French and I took our final shots at the retreating force, marking the last moments of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Every man in Reno's battalion knew it. The fight was over. Major Reno, Captain French, Captain Benteen, Captain McDougall, Captain Weir, Lieutenant Godfrey, and all the officers did everything they could to withstand the onslaught. Some of them, it seemed, were blessed with an almost supernatural protection to endure the hail of fire that had defined that infamous day. The sight that greeted us was both tragic and haunting. I believed the Indians had taken some of our men prisoner, and with the arrival of reinforcements, we discovered what seemed to be human bones and fragments of blue uniforms. It appeared the men had been bound to stakes or trees. The bodies of some of our officers, like Lieutenants Harrington, Porter, and Sturgis, were missing. At least, we hadn't found them then. We saw remnants of their uniforms and gauntlet gloves scattered on the field, a somber reminder of their fate. When it came time to bury our fallen comrades, many of the bodies remained unidentified. Once the Indians retreated beyond our sight, we scrambled out of our makeshift defenses and improved our rifle pits. We finally unsaddled our horses, something we hadn't done since the night of the 24th. 45 men had been killed. We unloaded the packs from the mules, fetched water from the river with camp kettles, and set up a better shelter for the horses and our wounded. Every action felt purposeful and urgent, knowing that another attack could come at any moment. Reno's command was hit hard, losing around 45 men and having 60 wounded between the fighting in the valley and the trenches on the bluffs. This grim tally speaks to the intensity of the clash. My own company, with 45 men and horses at the outset, counted 14 fallen, including the second lieutenant, and had 10 more wounded. About 15 horses were also lost or rendered useless. That night, a quiet settled around us as the Indians withdrew. At dawn, we peered from the bluffs toward the Indian camp. It was vacant except for some standing lodge poles. In the distance, we spotted a thick cloud of dust. A large group, either troops or Indians, was approaching the camp. With bated breath, some of the officers used their field glasses and thought they might be troops. Reno quickly sent scouts, and they returned with good news. It was the rest of our expedition, General Gibbon's command under General Alfred Terry. They had passed through Custer's battlefield, where they counted the bodies of 207 fallen men before crossing the river. Upon crossing, Terry's forces moved through the deserted Indian camp and continued along the valley of the Little Bighorn, reaching the place where Reno's men lay. They went further to a bend in the river where Reno's forces had retreated and made camp there. Seeing General Terry and his men made our hearts leap. The relief was palpable. As Terry's officers recounted the scene at Custer's battlefield, a solemn weight settled over us. Reno's men then began the somber task of burying the dead on the bluffs. The sadness was heavy, and a quiet understanding passed between us as we worked. We gathered the extra guns from the fallen and injured, broke their stocks, built a fire, and threw the weapons in. We did the same with surplus saddles and bridles, knowing we had no way to carry them. Terry's men offered help, stripping off their clothing to tend to our wounded, carrying them carefully down from the bluffs to their own camp. Afterward, we examined the horses. Those 2 gravely wounded to survive were put down. Parting with our horses was painful for some, yet there was no other choice. 5 companies of Reno's men then set out over the bluffs, heading toward Custer's battlefield. We came to a ford near the end of the bluff where we believe Custer attempted to cross toward the Indian camp, as we found some of his men's bodies lying nearby. These were the first remains we encountered from Custer's command. When Benteen's battalion reached Reno's position on the bluffs after Reno arrived from the valley, 5 companies moved along the ridge toward the battlefield where Custer had gone. Here, Reno's men faced another attack from the Indians, forcing us to fall back to secure the packs and our wounded. It seems that when Custer's fight began, Curly, a Crow Scout, managed to escape. He cleverly mingled with the Sioux, and when he saw his chance, swapped his crow blanket for a Sioux one and slipped into the brush, grabbing his pony. He gagged the pony with grass to keep it quiet and tied it securely to a tree. He then seized a Sioux pony and rode swiftly down the Little Bighorn, hoping to meet the reinforcements. Though pursued by Indians, he made it to General Terry, where he shared what he had witnessed. When describing the fight, Curly used hand gestures, mimicking the sound of gunfire, dropping his hands to show fallen men, and filling General Terry's hand with leaves to represent the countless Indian warriors. He drew dots on a paper showing soldiers surrounded by Indians. When asked how many had died, Curly sprinkled leaves over the drawing, saying, "The white men all dead, and the Indians as thick as leaves. At first, this story seemed unbelievable, yet tragically, it matched the horrific reality. Curley explained that he had sensed the massacre was certain and, during the fight, washed off his crow paint and lowered his hair, disguising himself among the Sioux. In the chaos, he eventually escaped, snatched a Sioux pony, and raced to where he knew Terry would arrive by the evening of the 26th. Captain Benteen's swift actions were nothing short of heroic, as they saved Reno and his men from near destruction. His bravery not only cleared the ravines of threatening Indian forces, but also paved the way for access to water, desperately needed by the wounded soldiers. For Reno, Benteen became an indispensable ally, offering guidance and support when it was most critical. Meanwhile, Dr. Porter found himself amid the chaos as Reno's troops frantically pushed towards the ford, desperately trying to outpace the Indians intent on taking scalps. Officers and soldiers surged past each other in a frantic rush, eventually converging in a chaotic crush of men and horses at the narrow pass. In the midst of this turmoil, Lieutenant Matthey stood out. Upon reaching the crest of the hill, he quickly constructed a makeshift barricade using fallen animals and supplies from the pack mules, creating a shield for the wounded, whose numbers quickly rose from 10 to 52. Dr. Porter also held deep respect for Fred Girard, who, with his basic medical knowledge, provided essential help. Girard not only assisted Porter in performing several amputations, but also offered invaluable support throughout the battle. Tragically, Dr. Lord was lost with General Custer's command, and DeWolf met his end on Reno's side of the hill. When the dust settled, those of us who remained looked out over the plains, a landscape forever changed by the battle. The Indians' retreat granted us a brief reprieve, yet the field below was a somber reminder of the lives lost. Captain Benteen's quick action had been our salvation, while General Terry's arrival brought relief amid grief and exhaustion. Burying fallen comrades, their memories weighed heavy in our hearts. I knew that this battle, with all its moments of courage and tragedy, would be a part of me forever, etched deep by the sacrifice and valor of that infamous day.